This is going to be a fun event. I think this is a little bit different from what we normally do. And we're glad that you all came. So I don't know if anybody else is sick of the pandemic and a little bit sick of Zoom, but if you are, you're not alone. And, you know, we do a lot of webinars. We all attend a lot of webinars. Webinars are great. But Caitlin and I have had this little, I don't know, thing that we joke about, that these, you know, this event is not a webinar. Of course, a lot of our, you know, our monthly webinars kind of are, but this time we're trying to do things a little bit different. We think you've probably seen enough slides over the last year, and maybe for the next hour, we can focus on a conversation instead. So how did today come to be? A few years ago at an ecosystem silviculture event, that's the big course that we offer every couple of years, John Almendinger, one of our guests today, gave a talk about ideas that Klaus Puettmann had written about in his book, A Critique of Silviculture. He was focused on a chapter called Silviculture and Ecology, Contrasting Views. And the chapter was about how foresters and ecologists see the world a little bit differently. John, as usual, gave a great talk, really interesting, good discussion from attendees and so on. And we decided after that, I thought it was such an interesting topic and a relevant thing for our typical audiences that, hey, let's do this live. Let's bring Klaus in and let's have a conversation. So I'm going to take a moment, introduce these two, and then we're going to get into a conversation on that topic, how silviculturists and foresters and ecologists see the world similarly and differently, and what lessons we can learn from those differences and from one another. So John Almendinger is known to many of you. He's now retired from the Minnesota DNR Division of Forestry. He's well known around Minnesota's woods. He was a key player in developing Minnesota's ecological classification system, something that many in our audience use, I think, on a near daily basis. It has become sort of the prevailing language and way of understanding and communicating about our native plant communities. And John has really had a huge impact on how forestry is practiced and understood in our state. So John, welcome. It's good to have you. Our other guest is Klaus Puettmann, formerly professor of silviculture at the University of, formerly at the University of Minnesota, now on the faculty at Oregon State. Klaus wrote the book that we're discussing today. He's also written numerous papers. He's kind of a provocative thinker and a leader in the silviculture field. And Klaus, it's great to have you here too. If you haven't read this chapter, that's okay. I sure encourage you to do it. We'll link to it on the event page for this webinar or this conversation, whatever this is. And we'll also link to it on the Camp 8 podcast. You may know, if you're a Camp 8 listener, that the podcast has been dormant for a little bit, but it's going to come back. And this conversation today, I expect, will be an episode in that podcast. So you should be able to find the chapter associated with either of those recordings. So Klaus and John, let's get into it. Let's start with a few terms. So that one of the big ideas in the chapter is about terminology. And I thought we might start with you, Klaus, talking about a few terms that foresters and ecologists understand differently. You describe a sort of hypothetical temperate deciduous forest undisturbed by fire or humans. And then you contrast that, or you look at alternatively a similar forest, but one that's been managed by the group selection system for about a century. And you mention a few ways that silviculturists and ecologists would see them differently. So as an example, describing the temperate deciduous forest undisturbed by fire or humans, you say a silviculturist might describe it as composed of 8 tree species. An ecologist might look at that same forest and say, well, it's composed of 13 trees, 5 shrubs, 45 herbs, 12 mosses, 65 known fungi, 4 rare bird nests, and so on. And Klaus, I wonder if you'd start us off by going a little bit deeper on that, describing some of those differences and why they matter.
Yeah, thanks, Eli. So first I should add that every discipline, of course, has its own terminology. And that's a good thing. It really helps us communicate efficiently and precisely on that. But of course, if disciplines have different terminologies, that creates problems when you communicate across disciplines on that. And that's obviously what we highlighted in the table and at the time. But I want to point out, just as important as problems with cross communication there is that the terminology also influences how we view the forest. What gets our attention and what does not, and how we interpret and value what we see. I'm no etymologist, but the specific choice can really send strong messages. So if I can pick on the SAF definition of silviculture, it interprets culture as controlling, by definition. Now, if you look at the Latin origin on that, I had a lot of Latin in high school, so you can also translate that or interpret that as nurturing, taking care of, and of course, that is quite a different interpretation, actually, an interpretation that I see when I discuss silviculture, but the native community here, it's more an indigenous view of looking at the forest. So if you just think about that difference, just imagine some parent would tell you their role is to control their children versus another set of parents telling you their role is to nurture their children. That's quite a different story what you get, and that's quite a different influence on that. So words do matter on that. And also, actually, I should point out any terminology or usage of verbiage is, of course, reflecting the larger cultural and philosophical setting at the time it was created on that. And that creates some problems for disciplines with a long history like silviculture. So as times change, really, we're kind of suggesting the critique that we need to step back and take a closer look at our terminology and see where it helps and hinders us as we deal with new upcoming challenges like climate change and global change issues. Or in the case that we highlight in the book here, is when we now have a greater emphasis on ecological aspects in forestry. I think this is what John can expand on. John, you want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. In my checkered past, I've worked for wildlife. I've worked for the Ecological and Water Resources Division, and then eventually switched to forestry. So I've been a firsthand witness to continued miscommunication amongst those three groups of people, and I have good friends in all of them. But I thought I might put a little bit of a Minnesota spin on some of the things Klaus just pointed out. And in his book, he talks about the fact that people don't see some of the same things. And the sort of crazy idea, when I was thinking about it, one reason foresters and ecologists in Minnesota don't see the same things is they rarely go into the same forest at the same time of year. The foresters work almost entirely when they can see the trees, and that makes perfect sense for them to work, especially in spring and fall, and especially when there's not so darn many bugs out. So I understand that, but the ecologists wouldn't even think about going into a woods until the sedges are mature enough to identify. So we very rarely spend the same kind of time, or even during the course of a season, spend the same times in a forest, with a few exceptions of joint site visits now in the DNR. The other point that he made that was a really good one is that foresters and ecologists haven't spent a lot of time communicating with each other. They sort of live in separate silos that way. And Minnesota is a good example. I would bet that most campuses are like this. But the Department of Ecology historically was on the Minneapolis campus in the Twin Cities. And probably for the culture reasons that Klaus just meant, silviculture and forestry got put on the agricultural campus. And it was rare to see students cross over between those two programs when I was doing some teaching there. So in people's minds, that was very separated, and we were content to stay in those silos for some time. The other thing he pointed out in his book was that we don't read the same stuff. Now, I don't know if people read anymore, but I think they do. but the forestry's been around for a long time. Journal of Forestry's been in publication, I think, since 1902. The Forest Service started almost immediately thereafter, and they had quite a history, and ecology wasn't even a recognized science at that time. So they've been publishing and talking about forest management for a very long point in time. And the Journal of Ecology is also pretty old, starting in 1920, but it didn't occur to the ecologists that our business was helping people make land management decisions. And the Journal of Applied Ecology didn't even bother to come out until 1991. So it's taken a while for ecologists and foresters to realize that we have mutual interests and we should be working together. That's enough for me.
We'll hear more from you. So another difference, and John touched on this a little bit in his reference to the agricultural model, but another difference that you talk about in the chapter, Klaus, involves how experiments are designed and how results are tabulated and reported. You write that many silviculture experiments are designed on an agricultural model. They measure average responses across a large treatment area, even when the treatments themselves are designed to produce variable conditions. And we see more and more of this in modern silviculture, where we talk about treatments that intentionally introduce variability across the treatment area. But still, in a lot of cases, silviculture experiments are looking for averages. You write that ecologists, on the other hand, are more interested in variation and extremes than averages. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. This is actually probably one example where I can see our book is start being a little dated on that. As you kind of pointed out, there's been a lot of progress being made with that in silviculture, of course, especially Minnesota with Brian and Tony's and Marcella's work, one of the leaders in that. But clearly, forestry research does come out of the agricultural model. The ANOVA that's driven by R.A. Fisher, he worked at the Agricultural Experiment Station in Rotherham, England. And so that does reflect it. And it's about the tools per se, but about, I think, how the tools end up driving how we look at the forest and then how we treat the forest on that. And so one assumption, of course, for the ANOVA, and also for regression for that matter, is that central value, that mean or median, that average is reflecting the conditions within the whole plot or within the whole stand, whatever treatment unit we are dealing with. And so if we make that assumption, and as you pointed out, that makes sense in some settings, but not in others on that. And we focus on that central value, using the variability only to test for significance of the different significant differences of the central value on that. And then to me, the second point is probably just as important. Typically in ANOVA, we end up with ranking the treatments, and we come to the conclusion this treatment is better than another one or all other ones. And so we're sending the message there is one best treatment. So if, we send the message that the stand is homogeneous, at least that's what we assume. And we analyze that, and then we teach it like that. And then we send the message there is one best treatment that we determined in our experiment. So the logical thing, of course, is for foresters, think about you get hired with a college degree, you're supposed to develop some treatment. You're going to take the second best or third best? Of course not. You're going to take the best. I think that kind of thinking then, pushed us to, even at a landscape scale, to be fairly homogeneous, and we find, standard treatments that are applied across the landscape. And in many cases, they may be the best, but then in other cases, they may not be on that. And again, the way we analyze the forest and the way we analyze our experiments, we're sending the signal to use that one treatment across the board, probably broader than it should be on that. Now, in contrast, of course, and John can expand on this, the whole multivariate statistics, that deals with the variability stuff, that's really where the emphasis is. In ecology, we don't see that much, or didn't used to see that much in forestry. John, you want to expand on this?
Sure. The thing that is really quite different is we sample forests differently. And in forestry, the stand concept has had several consequences to the way we try to understand stuff. And that is that we tend to go out and we already have delineated stands, which may or may not follow natural patterns of the vegetation. And we summarize that information and store it as an attribute of a particular parcel of land. Ecologists are more likely to do point sampling. We might have some areas involved in plots, but they're small in comparison to the size of a stand of trees. And our analytic techniques are really quite different. Most of it's multivariate analysis, and the variation is exactly what we're looking for. And in some cases, that kind of variation might be directly related to what we think of in terms of complexity at that very particular scale. So we tend to sample things differently. In spite of the fact that foresters do take point samples in order to characterize an average for a stand, the history, and things are changing now, but the history has been that those data are averaged and discarded. And ecologists right now would kill to have all those point samples back. And thankfully, at least the Superior and Chippewa National Forests have been keeping track now of all their point samplings, especially prism plots and just simple things like that. But it adds so much great detail that you can learn from the landscape, especially if you're mapping stuff. It's very helpful to hang on to all that information. So at the very least, we could improve the communication between foresters and ecologists by recognizing that we all take point samples, and we should be able to pool data and use, of course, similar lookup tables for the species and things like that. So that would be a benefit if we want to start communicating more clearly. Take it back, Klaus.
Yeah. I agree with you that a lot of progress has been made, and I see now that foresters publish also quite a bit, or silviculture is published quite a bit in ecological journals. There's been a little bit of a shift. I did a survey about 20 years ago, and the silviculture is published and read in that journal. And what I've noticed, being an editor and an author, on that there was a certain expectation and standardization that came about with every journal on that. And now when I see a lot more silviculture work actually also published in ecological journals, and again, I guess the Minnesota is a good example of that. They really rounded that corner, and that really will reflect how we look at the forest, and hopefully down the line how we manage the forest.
Yeah.
So one of the trends that we've seen, we talked a little bit about how silviculture has evolved and changed over time. We hear more and more about complexity, the importance of managing for complexity and various ways to do that. And I want to bring our conversation in that direction for a little bit. Now, we often hear that complexity is a good thing. The more complexity in the form of tree species, ages, stand structures, the more complexity we have, the more resilient that forest might be to unknown future conditions, which is very much an issue in an era of climate change and uncertainty. So I want to ask the two of you, and maybe we'll start with John this time. Is more complexity always better? Or are there situations where that's not the case? And how do foresters sort of conceptualize this? How should foresters be thinking about complexity? Should they always be aiming for more complexity, and in what forms? What are your thoughts on that?
I wish I knew for sure how to measure complexity. We have troubles deciding how to do these certain things, and you end up being very concerned about scale and thinking about how to measure exactly complexity. So even myself, I don't know exactly what complexity means, and it depends a lot on what kind of organism you're talking about. So what's complicated to a grasshopper is probably not the same thing that appears complicated to a wolf. So I don't know exactly what it is, but I do think we know enough to give some advice eventually, maybe toward the end of our conversation. We probably know enough that hanging on to all of the species present on the site is a good idea. So we try to maintain species diversity, which is something that we can measure. And here in Minnesota, we sometimes compare one kind of forest to another, or throw all our samples into a big multivariate analysis. And we can get some measurement of what diversity means, certainly for groups of things like vascular plants, or we might look at bird complexity in bird communities or something. So those things are somewhat measurable. I'm sure we want to hang on to that and think about that. Now, structural complexity is a bit of a different thing. It is done largely for wildlife, because that's mostly what we hear from wildlife managers is that, you know, these animals need this kind of complexity, or in the case of Kirtland's warblers or golden winged warblers, they need simplicity. So I think it's not always good to create more complexity. And it's worth pointing out that communities are different. Some of our communities, like a bog, they've got 18 species of vascular plants, and they're almost always exactly the same because of the extreme environment they live in. And from that perspective, it's not complex. A bryologist might disagree with me and point out that there are several interesting species of mosses there, but not usually. So different communities are different, and different growth stages of forests are different. Forests develop structurally following either a natural disturbance or a timber harvest, and they go through various stages of which a human might not perceive that as being complex. So the answer is, I guess if I had to make an answer, I would say trying to understand as best possible the natural disturbance regimes of forests, how they develop structurally over time, and trying to put a balance of that back on the landscape is sort of where I sit on thinking about this. And I'm pretty certain that diversity and complexity are related concepts, even if we can't totally define what complexity means.
Yeah, Klaus, I'd like your thoughts on that too. You told us a little bit of a short story as we were preparing for this conversation about editing your book for a new edition. You want to share that?
Yeah, for the 2013 book that Christian Messier led, the very last thing before we sent it to the editor is I went through it with the search through the whole book and had it stop every time we used the word complexity, complex. And I went through and then made a conscious decision whether to replace it with complicated, variable, heterogeneous, or diverse. And so the reason behind that is, you know, I wanted to reserve the use of the word complex to be more related to complex systems theory. And that's more than just a thought exercise. To me, it was really important to emphasize, you know, that diversity and heterogeneity are not a management goal by themselves, but that we really focus on how does that diversity relate to adaptive capacity, and how the system can respond to surprises in the future on that. So when complexity is really diversity that leads to novelty and innovation on that. Of course, that's a theoretical concept that we can't bring to the ground, and actually that will be the theme for, I have committed to writing another book and to explore that a little bit well beyond the theme for that. But what it really means, you know, when we think about diversity, it's more than counting species on that. It's more than counting sizes. It's really that we view diversity and variability, you know, for example, in terms of what plant or animal traits are out there. So do we have a diversity of traits, how plants respond to a diverse set of disturbances on that? And so do we have plants or stand structures that are more resilient to diverse or resistant to a diverse set of disturbances? So really thinking about novelty, resilience, and adaptive capacity when we address diversity. So at one time I gave a talk where I said basically complexity is diversity with a purpose on that, and that purpose is really thinking about adaptive capacity. And I do want to highlight, actually, John made a good point that one of the criticisms we got early on when we pushed the ideas of the critique of silviculture before it was even out published was that there are examples of forests that are not particularly diverse, at least as foresters measure it. And of course, here in the West, it would be the lodgepole pine forest that is very prominent, one species, and after fire, the same species will come back. So there's your resilience right there. And so to me, that really points out a little bit, yes, of course, the lodgepole pine forest is not that diverse in terms of tree species and, well, more diverse in terms of other species. And it's very well adapted and resilient to a very specific disturbance. And so as long as that disturbance keeps happening and keeps happening even at the same time interval, so if you get frequent fires, it's not resilient anymore. Or if you wait too long and we get an invasion of the true firs and stuff that change the fire behavior, it may not be resilient anymore. So within the constraints of a fairly stable yet dynamic disturbance regime, we don't need a big diversity to have a resilient adaptive system. But of course, the moment things change, like the mountain pine beetle, we get an insect coming in, or some other disturbances change, or as I pointed out, even the fire frequency changes, we'll see the limitation of that low diversity in that setting. And to me, there's the same thing, of course, you can apply in some ways to aspen stands on that. And, you know, aspen, and to me, it's always a difference if you bring in species that have multiple modes of regeneration. You automatically already, you increase the probability that that species can naturally reestablish and come back after any disturbance and repopulate the forest. So again, this is one where rather than counting species, you know, count, well, how tolerant are the species to climate change, temperature increases, drought incidents, or maybe other disturbances. And that's why you want the diversity rather than just focusing on species or even. And the same thing goes for structure in that sense. Some insects will attack small trees, seedlings. Other ones will attract mature trees on that. So you want to think about the same thing. You set up your landscape that one insect can wipe out everything, that maybe you have some barriers in that where insects can't spread across the landscape. You know, thinking about connectivity actually as a negative versus our typical positive view when we think about wildlife. Those kind of aspects come into complexity, I guess, as
really great stuff. We're going to go next, I think, back to something that John mentioned a minute ago about spatial scale. Before I ask that question, I want to suggest to folks, we've had a few great questions coming in over the chat, and I just want to encourage those of you who are watching and listening live to go ahead and add more. We'll be, John and Klaus and I will be talking for a little bit, and we'll handle questions and answers at the end. So I invite you to continue to add those questions. We've had some great ones. So a moment ago, John, you talked about complexity. You said that, you know, what's complex to a grasshopper might not be so complex to a wolf. And I want to go toward a really practical consideration. You know, many of our timber harvest areas are somewhere between 10 and 25 acres. There are administrative reasons for that. There are other reasons for that. Certification considerations might be one. Other thoughts, and whatever the reasons, I'm thinking about what managers can do. You know, we've heard about some innovative things. I'm a big fan of approaches that create large scale disturbance, not for everything we do, but there was an approach up on DNR forestry lands, state lands, way up on the North Shore involving this, what they called, I think, the super permit, very large, much larger than 25-acre treatment area. Not all contiguous, I don't think, but a you know, very large patch meant to replicate a large scale disturbance, maybe like a wildfire that might burn you know, much more than 25 acres. So there are some limits on that in terms of the patchwork of ownership and so on, but how can land managers be thinking about complexity at the, you know, at the levels that they're managing? And are there things they can do? I mean, would you like to see more large disturbances? Would you like to see more really small disturbances? Does it really totally depend on the plant community and growth stage? What are your thoughts on managing with sort of spatial scale and complexity in mind?
Okay, there was a lot packed into that.
Yes.
back to a couple of things that Klaus was saying. If you're an ecologist, the correct answer to every question is it depends. I mean, that's what we study, is interdependencies of things. We felt obliged, I mean, with this lodgepole pine example that he gave, and we've got similar examples with our jack pine here in Minnesota. The answer is always, it always depends. So we felt obliged for all of the 52 forested native plant communities that have commercial species in them to provide people with a couple of ideas about guidance. And one was developing, you could call them successional models, but they're basically stand dynamic models, so people can understand what happens to a forest if you don't do anything. And sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's not so good if you don't do anything. So we felt obliged there. We felt obliged also to look at how suitable trees are with sites, so that you can make some predictions about which of the 7 species here are more likely to respond well to the climate change we've already seen. So we've put some predictive kinds of things out there. If you're going to emulate in any fashion natural disturbances, which I'm a fan of, and several people here in Minnesota are, especially Brian Pollock at the research station, you darn well ought to tell a field forester what what the natural disturbance regime was. I mean, you can't just go, well, I don't know what, red pine trees look a lot like ponderosa pine, so it must be about the same. And the answer is it most certainly is not. I did get into, you asked about scale a little bit too. And are there things that we can do? Of course, there are things to do on 40 acres. I don't know if you want to finish there, but I mentioned it with the sampling techniques too. We've ended up with 20 to 40 acre patches of timber that get managed. There's probably a history behind that because we always have stalled stumpage here in Minnesota. And the loggers normally have to bond a certain amount of money. And at some point in time, people probably figured that, there was a limit to how much people could bond. And that probably has helped constrain the size of patches of forests that we manage. So I looked at your example on the North Shore where they had a super permit and a big thing, and they said, is that a good thing? Well, if it's the right community, and we do know from the disturbance history of these communities, roughly how big some of those patches were. We certainly know from Bud Heinzelman's fine research in the boundary waters what the sizes of some of those disturbances were. And if they're in one of those communities, it's a pretty darn good idea. And I'm sure that there's some organism out there that is appreciating us changing the size of some of these things. So right now, the answer is yes, we can do something. The biggest problems are going to be administrative hurdles and possibly some insect and disease concerns as well. So that's good. At the scale of a small stand, I'm a big fan of Jerry Franklin, who talks about forest legacies. And the easiest way that I can think of in a practical sense is to do things. You want to leave a legacy in every timber sale. And whether it's 10 acres or 100, you want to leave some legacy. And the point of it is to leave mostly the plants that were there before your treatment in some resistant wind, perhaps wind resistant patches and stuff like that. But you want to leave enough of that out there so that by the time you return, whether it's a full rotation or even a scheduled treatment at some point in time, the plants have an opportunity to recolonize habitat that they're obviously adapted to because they were there to begin with. The one thing that we hardly ever talk about that has always bothered me, I spent a day in the woods with a fellow named Burton Barnes, who wrote books on forest ecology. And we got talking about organics, and Franklin talks about organics too. We very rarely consider organic capital as something to think about when we're full tree skidding or going to buy, chip stuff for biofuel. I mean, here's the depends part. If you're in a fire dependent forest, removing biomass has always happened. Doing that again, even if we can't use prescribed burning to accomplish that goal, is a good idea. If you're in the mesic hardwood forest that we started out talking about a bit, you want to leave as much of that organic capital in place. So it always depends, which means our jobs in the future is to tell foresters why it depends, because it relates to the way the communities have historically operated. And now we have to make sure we're trying to anticipate some of the changes we're already facing. But chances are you will be more successful if you stay within what an ecologist would call the realized niche of the trees that we're trying to grow, rather than trying to use agricultural techniques to expand that realized niche into their environmental niche.
Can I respond to that? First,
Yes.
I'd say I think John interprets silviculture as nurturing. I guess that's really what I see with Franklin's approach, that he switched the definition a little bit. But I just want to highlight a few things. Actually, I like the notion of the administrative driver of our stand size. Out west here, the determination of stand size is really driven by what they could reach from the tower on the top when the first time out.
Yeah.
A little bigger, 20 to 50 acres, and no ecological reasons. But now with GIS and GPS and stuff, I see, at least in Europe, it's a movements to combine stands and stuff, and some of the administrative hurdles are disappearing for that. And I know we have worked with some loggers where we could get very complicated. We took a GPS recording, marked one tree, and they knew that they wanted to clear a 60-foot radius. And so we're getting there, that we can get away from that. But a lot of it is driven by the natural disturbances, as you point out, John. And I kind of want to criticize a little bit. I'm supposed to be provocative, right, Eli? So
Hey,
I'm
go
going
for it.
criticize a little bit the disturbance ecologists. In some ways, they've done the same thing. I keep seeing the mean fire return interval as a driver, how is, that we use to categorize our landscape and stuff. And so there's a lot of variability around that. And then, initially, even the big clear-cuts out west or in Scandinavia were justified. This is reflecting the ecological disturbance regime of the big fires. And so when we look closer here, we have some really good examples here in the West. We suddenly find that these stands, yes, they had big fires, and they had lots of other disturbances at smaller spatial scales along the way. And I think what we see now, and what we're kind of pushing with the complexity, that we recognize there's a variability of disturbances that results in this diversity in terms of species composition and structure. And in silviculture, we have ignored that and just zeroed in on that mean fire return interval or something like that.
Yeah.
So, but again, as I point out, there is quite a bit of movement in that arena, and I'm optimistic to make some progress, and we already have, actually.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I mean, calculating fire regimes is exceedingly difficult because there's no data, or very little. And we managed that by using historic, at turn of the century, information from survey notes. So those are just general ideas that we try to teach people, but to many ecologists, it turns out that they think that fire regime is the objective of what we're trying to do. So we've tried a little bit to talk not about frequency or particular treatment schedule you might want to do in a stand. You have to look at the effect that these things had. And it doesn't really matter what the timing is, as long as you emulate reasonably the effects. I'm quite satisfied with that. So yes, sometimes when you put too many big stories together about these different forest communities, people think that's the objective, and it's not. When you have a lot of public land, and one of the purposes is commercial timber production.
So much there. It's been fascinating. I want to pick up a little bit on this idea of emulating natural disturbance. We've had a couple of questions coming in that address that, and there's a common problem that it's, or not common, it's a well-known problem that we can't really perfectly emulate the effects of natural disturbances. So when we clear cut, we often say, well, that's analogous to stand replacing fire. And it's similar in many ways. It opens up a lot of growing space as a severe fire would, but it's also very different in terms of nutrient pulses and the state and abundance of nutrients available and the nature of the growing space. And someone pointed out in a question, some unfortunate legacies from past management may be compacted or rutted soils, that obviously wouldn't occur during a fire. So how do we, John, I know you're going to say that depends, but
Of course.
any thoughts on our, best efforts to do that? Should we be doing more prescribed burning after clear-cut harvesting in fire-dependent systems? Is that a partial solution? Are there other practical steps that might be available, for land managers to use on a relatively, frequent basis?
Well, I think the correct answer for prescribed burning is where it's safe.
Yeah.
And in Minnesota's landscape, we've got some places where it's totally safe. There's a big project on the Chippewa National Forest right now. We used to call it Pine Flats. I can't remember what the Nature Conservancy calls it now, but there's a big chunk of pine land that without dwellings and bordered by the Mississippi River and Highway 2. So it's a pretty safe place to do it. I don't look for forestry to change its attitude about fires and putting them out. I think that's going to go on. It's a good idea to prescribe burn afterwards. The results there would be mixed. One thing that the prescribed burning does do is put some biochar back in the soil, which is a very important element of fire-dependent forest soils because it has such high cation exchange capacity. So is it a good idea? Yes. I think a lot of our plantations, even though they're in the right community, we're seeing what we consider failures because they've just gotten so rich over the last several decades, and it's a process ecologists call mesification. But there is succession towards other forest types simply because fire's been eliminated. So would prescribed burning help? I think the answer is yes. We've been doing some stuff in Park Rapids, at least before I retired, that looked very promising. We achieved some of those results, the same or similar results, just by mowing. And in fact, in some cases, the mowing worked as well as, if not better, than a prescribed fire. And of course, there are prescribed fires and there are prescribed fires. Fire is never very consistent. And depending on the conditions, we get here in Minnesota, we get very few windows because we're so busy putting out grass fires someplace. We don't have the opportunity all the time. So my basic answer is, yeah, go for it. Do it safely. And when and where we think it will be most effective.
And Klaus, I'm going to ask you to follow up on that, but I'm going to see if you can pick up on another piece that you wrote not long ago. So a problem, so we were talking about ecological complexity or complexity on the ground. Another kind of complexity is, what the heck am I supposed to do here? These are complex systems and I don't know what to do. And, I can't do everything. I got to put up a lot of sales. I have to get my work done. And you've written a little bit about the role of simple guidelines to help land managers manage the complexity of all the many demands on their time and the idea of trying to achieve perfection. And you describe that as sort of the dog and Frisbee concept. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that and how, if we're seeking simple guidelines, what might those guidelines be?
Yeah, since you brought up the dog and Frisbee, now I got to explain that. It's a story from a talk by a British banker who's talking about the stock market. And the notion was, do you need complex rules to manage complex problems, which is kind of what we're talking about here. And so this banker uses the the complex task is to catch a Frisbee. So if you think about that, to catch a Frisbee, you got to know the velocity, the direction, how heavy it is, the wind and stuff, the slope of the topography, etc. And then you can calculate where the Frisbee will land, and then you can be there to catch it. Of course, the dog doesn't do that, the calculation. The dog will, keep a simple rule. And I guess if you're had a good baseball coach or a good soccer coach, you know that you keep your angle to the Frisbee the same. And so you have instant feedback. If the Frisbee moves to the left, you move to the left with it. And that's really what the dog does. Very simple rule. And that allows dogs, most dogs, not our dog though, to catch Frisbees in that setting. So when that plays out, I'm just thinking about, I've been out with landowners and we've had classes where we actually, put this into the field. So I'm basically start simple. So I figure, it's obvious when we go in the forest and a landowner says, yes, I like what you write. How can I implement this? The first thing we all got to recognize, they start with the conditions that they have, right? So they have that species composition, they have those soils, they have the loggers in place, the markets, the insect disease problems, etc. So nothing of that changes suddenly. So in that sense, and those constraints, of course, from the ownership objectives don't change either. So we discussed then that the current management prescription is a starting point. And then I guess as a rule in that sense, kind of try to overlay a filter on that and basically saying, okay, if you do this, and if you follow your standard procedure, will this push your ecosystem towards higher diversity, higher adaptive capacity, what we're really after, so diversity of relevant traits? Will it affect it at all, or will it not affect it and or even negatively affect it on that? And so, for example, if we talk about thinning, we talk about a standard thinning from below. So we cut the smaller trees, we homogenize the tree size and quality and species that's left afterwards. So that be homogenizing, we decreasing the potential traits that are in the forest. If we change the thinning prescription to maybe thinning across the diameter range in that setting, to leaving some of the trees with a broken top or the occasional fork, leaving minority species. Now, in many cases, at least, we can still accomplish the goals of some income. We accomplish the goal of thinning of improving the growing conditions for the residual trees. But if we increase some spatial variability, if we don't keep everything homogeneous in terms of spacing, we can open up some spots for early successional vegetation. So we increase the set of traits that we'll find in other plants as well, fairly efficiently. And especially actually, when we go out in the forest, we look for opportunities. Where can this be done at the least cost? So, it's for me, it's easy to convince foresters to leave the real craggly tree that doesn't sell anyway and stuff. So leaving that behind in this setting. We're looking for the opportunities. And similar, I guess, when we talk about tree planting, actually the one example I remember talking about replanting where you had spots with regeneration failures. And so the foresters spend a heck of a lot of time here chasing those down, replanting them. The replanted seedling costs 3 times as much as the original planting on that. And so when I talked about, using these spots or thinking of these spots as a diversity hotspot that will help the adaptive capacity of the stand, that by itself didn't get their attention until one of the people in the audience said, boy, this would make my life so much easier if I didn't have to do that. And suddenly we had everybody's attention that, they had a challenge in their job. And here was one where this challenge became an opportunity, or you could look at it as an opportunity. And people started running with that. And at the same time feeling that it's not going to cost them much. It may even make them money. Thinking about that replanted seedling, that's a field where at best it may be taken out in a thinning. It certainly won't be the prominent crop tree that will bring you the main income in that setting. And so again, we kind of we go through the stand and we look at spots. If you have the wet spots or the rocky outcrop, or sometimes the deer, the insects, or the deer and elk will tell you really where the regeneration failures are. So picking the problem area, so to speak, and taking it as an opportunity, and you can scale that up to the stands as well. You know, when landowners that have to get every stand to 80% stocking, and I talk to foresters, they spend a big chunk of their effort on those few problem stands where for one reason or another, they have a tough time getting the stocking level up. And if they could just, you know, say we need 80% stocked, and 20%, maybe 50% stocking is enough. That would make their life a lot easier. I bet you it wouldn't cost much. Maybe even they make money by letting a few stands, you know, develop differently, and it could make a big difference in the landscape in terms of adaptive capacity. And that's really the approach I've been taking, and I find, because the moment foresters see how it helps them with all other aspects of their jobs, or at least some of them, they get really excited about it.
John, anything to add to that?
Oh, the one thing, I like the Frisbee story. But if you're the dog, what's going on is constant feedback and adaptation. He's watching it fly. He's focused on maintaining that angle. And if there's something that we haven't done a real good job of here in Minnesota is monitoring and paying attention to what's happening based on a treatment and whether it's worth corrective action or something like that. So it's like shoving your kid down a steep hill with a tree at the bottom and not having mom down there to at least make a last minute correction at some critical point. So monitoring is important. And I said these things to plug your case studies that you've been instrumental in getting up. It's an old idea that Dan Hansen and I had a long time ago, but we just don't do very much monitoring. And this is an opportunity to at least see, well, if some of these ecological ideas actually work. And if you can, if there are things to do for correction or not worry about, it's worth paying attention to those case studies. We have very precious little in the way of actual monitoring going on in the state. And it's just getting started, and you're dealing with a profession that, you know, looks at the lifetime of trees. So it's not like we've got, other than retrospective case studies, which are hard to put together because you have to have the history, but those are worth paying attention to. And I think that's going to help a lot with communication between ecologists and foresters. If there are field trip sites you can go to, look at, know what happened, that I think is a step in the right direction for getting ecologists and foresters talking to each other and understanding each other.
Yeah, I appreciate your mentioning the Great Lakes Silviculture Library. I really agree with you. I think that the case studies that land managers are sharing there give a lot of insight into what's going on the ground. What are those little lessons that people have learned? And they also create opportunities to revisit those sites, as you say, John, during field tours and other things, and for others to learn from that work as well. I'm going to transition a little bit to some Q&A. I've already shared a little bit of that before, but there's a long question here. I'm going to shorten it a bit. I think it came from Ryan DeSantis, but I think it's really a great question. In a sense, the idea of increasing resilience is en vogue. It's popular now, much like the idea of returning ecosystems to the historic range of variability was in vogue in the past. If going from a focus on HRV to a focus on resilience can be seen as a paradigm shift, what do you see as the next emerging shift as we learn more about forests?
Well, you know what, if you look through my more recent writing, certainly, I've been trying to avoid the word resilience on that, and partially because, you know, in English, if you put RE in front, you're looking backwards on that. Well, no, there's no way around that. And so I'm really pushing her to think about, you know, adaptive capacity and in preparing for surprises, and surprises that are outside the historic range of variability. So, you know, you want to think about some of the mechanisms that drive our ecosystem response to changes, you know, what different pathways they can take. and then think about increasing the possible pathways and flexibility, both for the ecosystem, but I guess the same thing, of course, goes for forestry organization, and the same thing eventually goes for communities that are dependent on the forest in some fashion. And you got to keep in mind, especially with global change or climate change, we have some trends that are quite predictable. I think the temperature will keep going up, and there's not much discussion about that. Other ones will be more random, and then we have some of them we don't even know about what is going to come, and different mechanisms, adaptation mechanisms will be able to respond to those. And that's really the challenge, to think beyond, well, we're just going to move trees north and that will help with climate change. We have some examples here where we did that with Douglas fir, and then it turns out that the fungal community in the wetter, drier area killed off the seedlings. So they may be growing better, but they weren't adapted to the spore loads of the local fungi. This thing. So I think thinking about more multidimensional, and just accepting uncertainty as being part of the package, no matter how much we try. We may use the word prescription, which is another label there on that tells you control things. But in the end, the ecosystem will respond in its own ways. And the paradigm shift I like to see is that we start recognizing those through monitoring, as John pointed out, and then be able to take advantage of that rather than fight it. Like I tell my brother, he's managing my forest land in Germany, and they have some beetle damage, so he's clearing quite a bit of area. And when he said, what should I do? What should I plant? And I said, well, whatever you choose, what can be harvested and makes most money in 80 years, that wouldn't be on top of my criteria list right now. I would have a lot of other concerns I would bring in before I make that the driver.
Next question is about invasive species. And John, maybe we'll start with you. Should invasive species be considered in terms of adding to forest diversity, maybe, or complexity? Or should they be automatically eliminated? So you're the person behind our understanding of native plant communities and ecological classification and how these things change over time. How do invasive species fit into all of this?
Oh, boy. Well, I wish not at all. To be clear, I mean, no, I am an advocate of trying to diminish those populations as much as possible. But some of what people have been saying isn't true. I mean, we've got a lot of stuff on those lists that really evaporate as soon as forest canopy closes. So, but are there a listing of ones that are going to be very difficult? Absolutely. I mean, buckthorn is one who's demonstrated incredible ability to grow under a forest canopy, and it can form almost pure thickets that look a little like plant deserts underneath them. They're very prolific, and they certainly aren't botanically interesting by the time you see something like that. There's an orchid that is invading now that's very shade tolerant. Garlic mustard is. So as a forestry person, I'm mostly concerned about the shade tolerant invasive species. The others come into play during regeneration. If we are going to continue to regenerate trees, mostly by planting out in the open, then all of a sudden a lot of those invasive species become somewhat important because they have some allelopathic abilities. So for a practical standpoint, they play a role in that. So I guess my vote right now is to continue to resist, but resistance is probably long-term is futile. And hopefully, if we can keep enough native species on these sites, not to try to totally convert the entire assemblages of species, I think that's the best we're going to do, and we're probably going to have to live with things like buckthorn in the understory. So do the best you can.
Great. So I just want to note something. We're at our time. It's at 11 o'clock. I just cannot bring this conversation to a close right now. So if I can prevail on John and Klaus to stick with us for a couple more minutes through 2 or 3 more questions, I just think that would be great.
Okay.
But I do want to also, again, recognize that we're at our time. Those of you who have tuned in and who are interested in continuing education credits, Caitlin shared a link to the continuing education credit request form. You can find that in the chat. And I think when you leave this meeting, you'll also be automatically redirected to that form. And I want to thank everyone for coming. If you do need to move on, of course, you should feel welcome to do that. But I've got 3 more questions here that I think I want to get to. One is, should foresters view thinnings as regeneration opportunities as well? Silvicultural textbooks often state reproduction established following a thinning as wasted growing space that should be used by residual trees. Of course, it depends on the system you're managing. John, I know where your mind is going. And before asking this question, I admit that I looked in our participant list to see if Marcella Windmuller Campione was on the meeting, because I know she's so focused on terminology and what's the intent of a thinning. It's not regeneration. But I wanted to ask, and Klaus, why don't you start with that one?
Yeah, I think Brian asked, he was probably one of the reviewers when I published a paper. I published a few papers of regeneration after thinning on our experimental sites. And in one journal it came in clean, and another one I had to eliminate the word thinning on that because of the terminology. But to me, again, I think if you think about adaptive capacity, the advanced regeneration has an opportunity to expand that. You know, I remember an example. I was out on the Chippewa National Forest, and it was a 70-year-old white pine stand that had been thinned, and it had this beautiful regeneration underneath, white pine regeneration.
Yep.
And so when I talked to the forester at the time, I said, wow, you know, run with this, you know, convert this into a regeneration harvest and start taking advantage of the natural regen that came in after the cleanup. Well, it turns out the Forest Service would not regenerate those stands till 120-year-old. It's white pine at the time. That was the policy. So I haven't been back later, but I'm assuming by now the regeneration has disappeared. And we had the discussion how much time and effort and money it would cost to get back there in terms of white pine regeneration that we had gone at the time already. But to me, you know, even if it wasn't an intent, you know, you had some natural trends, and as kind of John already hinted, if you nurture the forest, here you can run with that trend. And yes, you would change, at least in patches, your H-class rules, I guess, in terms of that. But there's a lot to be gained by being more flexible. And this is really what I mean when I talk about the terminology. You know, the terminology, like, you know, some of the harvesting pattern shelter, but it was focused on creating the best condition for regeneration on that. And now with the residuals, it kind of gets fuzzy because we want more than regeneration during our harvest. And that's where, you know, some of the terminology may get in the way. And to me, the thinning is one example on that. And it'd be interesting to look at other disciplines, how they deal with that when the rules change, how they modify their terminology, or if they do, to accommodate that. So for me, it's an easy one. If I end up getting natural regeneration, I will look very closely whether I can take advantage of that and run with that and shift gears a little bit. But again, it takes the monitoring, as John pointed out, and it takes the flexibility in management and rules.
So let's go back to a very Minnesota specific question. John, I know you're going to like this one. How do current high deer populations and deer population goals affect our opportunities to nurture the forest? What's a realistic level of deer per square mile for adequate complexity and successful regeneration? For example, in systems like MHC 26 or MHC 37.
Okay, what's the ideal deer population? 0.
Oh, what's a realistic level of deer per square mile?
Realistic.
what does realistic mean? I'm looking forward to your answer to this
Well,
one.
first of all, both of those communities occur in places that were loaded with oak dominated brushland and a lot more frequent fire disturbance regime, although I think they were MH examples. But that landscape where he's talking about has always been chock full of deer. And it's natural for them to be there. Now that there's agriculture and stuff, there's going to be a lot of deer. I got involved in it. This is bringing back a 20-year-old nightmare that I had at Itasca State Park, because it was basically the same question while I listened to forestry and wildlife go back and forth. And well, it wasn't a pleasant conversation. And I was on that panel and tried to evaporate immediately after we adjourned. What's an ideal level? I do think that natural regeneration's got a lot better shot at surviving browsing. And if they're talking about oak, coppicing oaks when they're little is not a bad idea anyway. If it worked that way, it would be okay. But I have seen us plant oak in one of those communities, MHC 26, and struggled for years and years and replanted, and they absolutely creamed it. I mean, the deer just totally wiped it out every year. We had seedlings with big caliper. So if you could have kept them off for a while, I think it would, if you'd exclosed deer there, I think it would have been an incredibly successful attempt. But the idea is excluding them. I mean, maybe you can convince wildlife to put free deer tags and put deer stands up on all of our clear cuts and forget the opening program, which we try to maintain.
Yeah. Thanks, John.
I am no expert on deer. It is a problem for us, though.
Yeah. Interesting question here from Sawyer Scherer. Foresters can sometimes be hesitant to increase diversity in a stand due to uncertainty in future markets. In other words, we don't know what the future markets are going to be. Let's maybe just continue to manage for our existing markets, and maybe it's more likely that those existing markets will continue to be here in the future. All that being said, we're all aware that timber markets have changed dramatically over the last 100 years, and we expect them to continue to do so. So how can we bridge the gap for people who are hesitant to change because of what they see as existing markets, maybe to embrace some of these ideas and maybe create more diversity to accommodate whatever future markets might be?
That if I can start, of course, I don't have the simple recipe here, which kind of defeats my whole story anyway. But this really highlights that, the forestry sector in the broadest sense has to think about adaptive capacity and change. It's not enough to think, no, we change the species we plant, or we change something in the silviculture end, and then we will be successful in maintaining all the benefits of forest in the uncertain future. So this really highlights that. I think the milling industry has to think about that as well. The communities that are dominated by forest and forest operation have to think about that as well. The rules and regulations have to think about that as well. There's some market incentive opportunities. I've seen that in Europe. My brother works in that, where they subsidize certain milling structure to facilitate some silviculture in the field. This really highlights that, obviously, whatever we do in silviculture is in a larger context, and we have to work on that broad context as well. We can't just be isolated looking at our world and have that happen.
All right, let's ask one more question and then we'll close it. This has just been great. Again, I want to thank folks for the great questions. This one's from Aitkin County Land Department. Aitkin County Land Department is looking at changing to 20-year entries with its uneven aged management because of observations of recovery after harvests in northern hardwood stands. The time between entries has been longer than anticipated. Any thoughts on that? On the time of entry, time of re-entry for uneven aged management in northern hardwoods in Minnesota?
Eli well, the question was about whether they're too long and they had to shorten entries or they had to lengthen them.
I was just typing a response to see if I could get clarification on that from the person who asked the question. So I'll watch the chat. Maybe he can fill it in, but I'm not certain if they were looking at extending those entries longer than they had been previously, or thinking that maybe 20 years is too soon and they should go longer.
I would pay attention to what they looked like at age 15.
Yeah, he said they had to lengthen the interval between entries.
Okay. Well, once again, it depends. I mean, what kind of soils are you on, and how many passes of heavy equipment can they handle? Most regeneration failure on some of these kinds of things are in the ruts and compacted soils that you're going to have with heavy equipment. So I know Bland and Paper, at one point in time, they decided that the way to manage hardwoods was to just go ahead and maintain a road system, but you don't drive off of it. You know, to put harvesters within reach of virtually everything, and you stay off of the other areas. So their attitude was, you might as well just give up on 5% of this site. It's going to be maintain skid trails. So that's one thing I have seen us do. But I can see shorter entries even. I know they said they had to lengthen them, but you about got to go out there at age 15 and then make your mind up whether you're going to wait 5 years or 15 more.
Well, I think this is a good example. It's been a while since I've walked around in Aiken County Forest, but this is a good example where obviously lots of drivers drive this return interval on that, and you know, the amount of harvesting or volume harvested to justify the economic expense, etc., and then ecological development and the stand. And to me, it really pushes us to think to be more flexible in that setting. You know, even in uneven age stands, they're not perfectly, you know, continuous, even uneven age, so to speak. There may be times when they are so dynamic that you do want at least a pre-commercial entry at shorter intervals. And other times you can wait a little bit longer, depends on how intensive the interval is in this kind of setting. You know, if you have a new machinery or new harvesting technology, that provides some opportunities on that. So this is one example. Or if the market changes and suddenly a certain species gets high in price, you can benefit from that variability. So I can see that for logistical purposes, we want to lock in on a return interval. But I think for an organization, the more flexibility over space and time you can build into that, I think the better off, you know, the organization as well as the forest will be.
Thanks, Klaus. I think that's a good way to end our conversation. This has really been a lot of fun. We did aim to do something a little bit different, and I'm really pleased with what we were able to do. I am very grateful, John and Klaus, to both of you for taking the time out of your schedules and for fiddling around a little bit to make sure that we had a strong connection, internet connection, and things like that. So thank you for your interest and willingness, and also for doing some backflips to make this work. Thanks also to all of you who tuned in. We had a really good turnout. And I think based on that turnout and on the discussion that we've seen, we'll likely pursue ideas like this again. We do have our webinar series planned out for the rest of this year, but I think this is fun, and I think we want to do this again. Before you go, if you haven't yet, I want to draw your attention to next month's webinar. It's going to be another good one. It will be a more traditional format, but it's with Heidi Roop. Heidi is a new climatologist, faculty member with the University of Minnesota Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. She's going to be talking about from data to dialogue, effective climate change communication. Caitlin just put a link in the chat. Thank you, Caitlin, for that. Heidi is a great communicator, and I think that that'll be an interesting topic to hear her explore. I encourage you to join us again in a month. That's on Tuesday, May 18th. And as I said, oh, and yes, Caitlin, we're back to 9 a.m. next month, not 10 a.m. There's no one in the Pacific time zone next month, so we'll be back to our usual time. I think that's it. Rather than rambling further, I'll draw us to a close. Thank you again so much, John and Klaus, for your time. This has been great. And thanks to all the rest of you for joining us. Hope to see you next month.